We live? All right. All right, we're in chapter 19 of Exodus tonight, finishing up the second half of the chapter. Now, one of my co-workers at CSU, Pete Link, some of you know him, Old Testament professor, makes the argument that tonight's passage we're looking at is the most important passage, specifically verse 16, in the entire Bible. And his argument is everything prior to it leads up to this passage, and everything after it is an explanation or a fulfillment of this passage. I'm not entirely convinced. If he's listening, I'm not entirely convinced. But he does make an interesting argument as he strings various pieces together. But it is certainly a turning point in the story of Exodus. And so when we read it, listen for what's happening in the shift that takes place there. So chapter 19, we're going to start at verse 16, read to the end of the chapter. On the morning of the third day, there were thunder and lightnings, and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down and warn the people, lest they break through the Lord to look, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them." And Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, 'Set limits around the mountain and consecrate it.' And the Lord said to him, 'Go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them.' So Moses went down to the people, and he told them." And so put this in context. Remind us where we're at in the storyline. Moses and the Israelites, with the passage we looked at last week, have arrived at Mount Sinai after 3 months of roaming from Egypt to get there. So we're 3 months into the Exodus. They're finally there. As we ended last week's passage, we saw God's commands there through Moses to the people that they're supposed to spend 2 days consecrating themselves, setting themselves aside for divine spiritual purposes. In fact, it dawned on me today, for whatever reason, random thoughts come at random times. I was thinking of the word desecrate, which is the opposite. If something is desecrated, it's what? It's removed from its holy purposes. And so I was wondering, what's the difference in the prefix? Con is in consecrate, and desecrate. D clearly means pull away, destroy, take apart, whatever. Con is often used in older English and coming out of the Latin for united with. And so when you consecrate something, you unite yourself to that thing. And when you desecrate it, you are ripping it apart. You're tearing it down from what it was. And so the people have been called for the last 2 days prior to the event we're looking at tonight to prepare themselves to enter into God's presence, to consecrate, to dedicate themselves, to get them ready for that union. Then that's where we pick up in verse 16. So let's reread it. If Link is right, let's reread the verse, make sure we see what's there. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. As you're working through the handout, let's make sure we get through there first. So, as promised, what he'd said earlier in chapter 19, God came down on top of the mountain on what? Third day. So the connection to come into God's presence, third day is going to be vital. Foreshadowing what event? The resurrection. So third day is vitally important connection to God. Here's the way they're going to get to God, dedicate themselves to him, unite with him. Third day is going to be key. And then he describes the events that were predicted. And storms, remember, in the Old Testament, we're only halfway through the second book, storms are often used to portray great power. Anybody who's ridden, we were talking about it a little before service started, anybody who's ever ridden through a hurricane or lived through a tornado, you know what we're talking about. Everybody's awed by the power of storms of that magnitude. And so that's ancient. I mean, think about it. If you had no meteorological explanation, I mean, just think how far weathermen have come. We make fun of them all the time. But think about what we now know about weather we didn't even know 30 or 40 years ago. So imagine you're out in the middle of nowhere. Maybe you're in a valley. I remember my great-grandmother once talked about the fact the first time she left the mountains of West Virginia, she lived in a holler where the hills like this. Vance, how much weather do you see? About a quarter of a mile. First time she came down out of the mountains into what she thought was flatlands, all of a sudden you see storms 40 and 50 miles away, and she thought it was the end of the world. So imagine 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years ago, people who have no explanation, and all of a sudden these storms pop up out of nowhere. And think of some of the cloud formations we're always awed by when we see them on TV. And so storms are power, destructive power, chaos, right? Some religions have a chaos god connected to the storms. Think of even Genesis 1. God created the heavens and the earth, and what's that around the creation? It's formless and void, and there's deeps, and the stormy, it's power. And so storms represent this power coming. And of course, there's a lot going on in this storm. There's thunders, and there's lightnings. And it might be, it's just speculation, but the reference to the lightning might be a reference for us to think about the pillar of fire. Because how did they know where God was at? They followed the pillar of fire by day. And so maybe the fire is not literally fire like Cecil B. DeMille showed. Maybe the fire was this constant lightning storm that led them, since so often God's presence is represented by lightning. And then, of course, around the top of the mountain is what? A very thick cloud. And, of course, what was the other symbol of God's presence? The pillar of cloud that led them through the wilderness. And so there may be references backwards and forwards to those things here. And the other thing God predicted, that he said, when I come on the third day, this is what you're going to know, and that is the trumpet. Now remember, of course, all through Scripture, trumpets are used on special occasions. Special occasions like the beginning of the Exodus, special occasions to rally to the temple or the tabernacle, special occasions particularly to announce the arrival of the king. Right? The victorious king is coming, so the trumpets come to announce his arrival. So here's God the King, one of those themes that I've been harping on since we started Genesis 1, how many ever years ago now. God is the King. He's arriving. And if you jump forward to the New Testament, according to 1 Thessalonians 4:16, Jesus' arrival is going to be announced by a trumpet. And the trump shall sound. Think of all the old hymns that kind of follow that theme and train of thought. So all that's going on. This is all predicted up above in chapter 19. But while we're thinking about that, let's go up the page, if you got a Bible, or up your screen. And let's see what he said about this. Look at verse 13. He's told him not to touch the mountain, nor to go up on it. Then in the middle of verse 13, it says, and when the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So the trumpet's going to not only announce the coming of God, it's to do what? It's to rally the troops to get them to come to God. But when we look at verse 16, what did the people do? What's the end of verse 16 say they did instead? They trembled. Now, I think there are two things going on here. One I'm certain is going on here. One Pete Link thinks is going on here. So let's give the one that's on the handout first. I think the obvious reading of their trembling here is, trembling is a sign of what? Fear. And so I think part of what's being portrayed here is the seriousness of the occasion. You know, it's one thing to say you're ready to meet God. It's one thing to say you can't wait for Jesus to come back. It's another thing when it actually finally happens. I think that's an easy way to read it. Because, yeah, this is going to happen. Now it's happened. Especially if you remember what he said earlier in the passage. What's going to happen if they mistreat the occasion? Death. Because what happens when sinners enter the presence of God? Death. Now, here's something unique's happening. God is coming to the sinner, not vice versa. So I think that at minimum is what's going on here when it says at the end of verse 16, they trembled. Link's argument is they disobeyed. It's not merely they were afraid, they rebelled. Because what did verse 13 say when we just read that a minute ago? When the trumpet sounds, what are they supposed to do? Come up to God. And so rather than coming to God, they let their fear, their unbelief, rule over them. And so his whole argument is everything in the Old Testament could have been solved in verse 16. Everything that's happened since the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden was just answered. God has come to his people. And what did the people do? They refused to come to God. I think that's an interesting read. Part of my take on it is, well, they're afraid to go because they're told don't touch the mountain. Link's answer is they were told not to touch the mountain until God came. Don't come until God says come. And so somewhere, either we're both wrong or one of us is right. But the picture is God has arrived, and what are the people? They're afraid. They're not ready to come into the presence of God yet. Whether rebellion, fear, disbelief, whatever. And so they stay at the bottom of the mountain. That then might make more sense of what then follows as we read on through verse 17. So then, because the people are trembling, or then because God has arrived at the mountain, then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. So here's Moses playing a role we're now very familiar with in Exodus. Moses, the mediator, right, brings the people out to meet God. He's talked with God before, multiple times. And he's lived. Come with me. And so he brings the people out to meet God. Now, don't miss the fact that Moses clearly says here in this verse that the people had to go out to meet him. They were in the camp at the base of the mountain. They had to go out to meet him. And it reminds me of something Henry Blackaby said years ago in the book Experiencing God. It says you can't go with God and stay where you're at. That's one of those, there's several teachings out of the book, but that's one that has stuck with me all these years. God is always moving. We can't stay where we're at because he's moving on. Or, in the case here, if we're living in our sin and he comes for us, we can't stay in our sin. And so Moses has to lead them out of the camp. And so he leads them out, million and a half people, whatever there are, and he takes them out to the base of the mountain. And it's interesting, he then says, when they got there, the people took their stand. They took their stand at the base of the mountain. That's clearly military language, isn't it? And again, we've seen them portrayed as an army already in Exodus. They come out and they take their stand. I don't think they're coming out to take their stand in combat against God. I think the picture is this is a great assembly, right? This is the regimental assembly where you bring everybody together for the marching and review. And so you bring out all the troops, and they're coming out organized. And I think the picture here is that they're coming out by family or tribal groups. Because remember, in chapter 18, what did Jethro recommend Moses do? Appoint leaders at what level? Family, clan, tribe, right? 50s, hundreds, thousands. So they're already organized. So all Moses has got to do is not stand on some type of the thing and go, okay, everybody, let's go. What's he do? He tells his 100 leaders or whatever there are, get your people in an hour, we're moving. And so they came out and they took their stand. They're organized, seemingly ready to encounter God. Then verse 18 returns back to this imagery of the theophany. Remember, we talked about this last week, this idea of a theophany. Remember, theos, theo, is the Greek word for God. And so the idea here is a theophany is a physical manifestation, something you can see or hear. It's a physical manifestation of a spiritual reality. Since you can't see God, since you can't touch God, God is spirit, how are they going to know God's there? He physically manifests himself in a way they can understand and see. And so he's back to describing that scene on the mountain that they knew that God was there coming down for them. So we're back to the scene. That's how Moses begins the sentence. Now, remember that's that word Moses likes to use so often. Now, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And so here's this thing, down the valley, at the plain, right in front of the mountain. They're there looking up. They're observing all this is going on. They can't miss it. It's already caused them to tremble in fear. Whole mountain is cloaked in smoke. It's not clouds, it's smoke. And why is it smoking? Because the Lord came down how? In fire. Which, by the way, what was the manifestation of God when Moses first encountered him? On the mountain. Burning bush in a fire. So here it is. And we talked about this last week, the idea of God as a consuming fire. And so the mountain's covered in smoke. But not only is the idea that God came down, Moses also wants to describe here for us that the smoke of the fire is now rising off of the mountain like it's coming from a kiln, or think of a furnace. And so you've got the up and the down and all this imagery. And then something new is described here. Just like the people in verse 16, the mountain also trembled. The mountain is trembling. Now, because of this language, think of people who are in our modern day anti-supernatural, even devout Christians who want to believe the Bible. Supernatural stuff, man, that's hard to get. So we look for naturalistic explanations. This has led a lot of folks, skeptics and those who are just trying to make sense of it in a way they can understand it. They've taken this language of thunder and lightning up in verse 16, and smoke and fire and billowing clouds of smoke rising off the mountain to be some sort of a description of a volcanic eruption. Because what happens in a volcanic eruption? Often there's earthquakes. If you remember from the imagery from Mount St. Helens, which we're now, how many years after Mount St. Helens? This week or last week was the anniversary of it. Is it 86, 87? So, long time. And they've just now come across a relatively new photo that has been discovered, kind of buried, of somebody who was there and survived because he was on the right side of the mountain when it blew up. But if you remember that imagery, what do you see in the cloud of ash going up? Lightning, because of all the static electricity. Mount St. Helens didn't have lava, but other volcanoes, that's what we typically think of, Kilauea or whatnot. But all these things sound very volcanic. And so a lot of folks go, that's what's being described here. First of all, there's no evidence that Jebel Musa or any other mountain in the Sinai is a volcano, but there's a description in the text that tells you it can't be a volcanic eruption. There's one more descriptor that says you can't explain this away with naturalistic terms. What is it? It's the trumpet. If all the other things were there only, you go, yeah, maybe it is a volcano. But there's a sound of a trumpet. And there's nothing about a volcano that sounds like a trumpet blowing. Nothing about a volcano sounds like somebody trying to blow a bugle who doesn't know what they're doing. There's something else going on here. Instead, I would contend what Moses is describing here is a scene very reminiscent of Isaiah chapter 6, verse 4. Another encounter of a sinner with God. Isaiah 6:4. You're familiar with the passage, many of you are, where Isaiah has his vision. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. There's that language of up. The train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. And with 2 he flew. And one called to another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. What I think is the most important verse in the Bible. And then verse 4, the foundations of the thresholds shook. The building trembled at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And so I think Isaiah is intentionally picking up on the language and imagery of Isaiah, or of Exodus, that is. And so I think you can poo-poo away the volcano explanation. A, you don't need it, because God can do whatever God wants. And B, the trumpet undermines the natural explanation. And C, this is the kind of imagery we get of God's presence all the time. And so either there's a lot of volcanic eruptions, or God's arrival is even greater than a volcanic eruption. And so they're down at the bottom, they're looking up, and they're probably understandably freaking out. Because what has Moses done with them? He's brought them closer to the mountain. He didn't take them farther away. You're afraid. Where do you want to go? That way. And he's got them going that way. And so the theophany is this reminder of God's arrival. Verse 19. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. And so, two things happen here. Sound of the trumpet is getting louder and louder. Celebration, announcing the arrival of the king. He's here. It's getting louder and louder. People have already freaked out about that once. Now they're closer to the mountain. And then the weirdest thing happens of all this. The ones who are close enough can see it. Moses spoke to God. Moses, the mediator, is now talking to God in front of them on their behalf. And not only is Moses speaking, God answered. And he answered in such a way that when the thunder rolled, they went, that's not just thunder, that's the response to what Moses said. So it's not Moses yelling over thunder going, can you hear me now? It's like he gets quiet. Moses says something, and then the thunder responds. And then Moses says something else, and the thunder responds. And so the people are clearly making the connection. Moses is talking to God. We can understand Moses. We can't understand God. There's a divide between us. But Moses, the mediator, is here to bring us to him. And all of this would have taken place in view of the nation. Because what's he done? He's brought them out. And now he's standing in their head, and they're watching, waiting to see what is going to happen next. Verse 20 tells us what happens next. The Lord, this is God, the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. And the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain. And Moses went up. And so, up to this point in this paragraph, every reference has been to God, Elohim. Now, the reference is Lord. Remember, the Lord is the language of the covenant relationship. The Lord, God, did what? He came down. He came down to the people. Because what happened the last time people tried to go up to God? Babel. So God has to come down. But when God comes down, he calls to Moses, and what does Moses have to do? He went up. In the same way, later, Christ is described as the one who has ascended to the Father. Who can ascend to the Father but the one who's come down from the Father? And so, more language of parallelism there between Moses and Christ. But there's something interesting here in this language of down and up. Because what's going on here is, using language from the Puritans, God condescended to meet with Moses. Moses or anybody else, nobody could go up to God. The only way we can be in the presence of God is what must happen. God must come down. And the Puritans like that language of condescended. By the way, there's that prefix con again. Together they descended. But it doesn't mean what we often think, oh, you're so condescending. Condescending in the negative sense, as we use it today, is somebody speaking down to me like they're better than me. But the Puritans like the word condescending because God is what? He is better than us. He has every reason to look down on us, to talk down to us. And so what happens when you use the word condescending correctly is the idea that though he's here, he wants to be here. And so he comes down to our level so that we can relate. Right? It's like the adult who gets down on their knee to talk to a child eyeball to eyeball. Are they equals? Not even close. But what does the adult want the child to feel like? That he is an equal. And so the language here is God, who didn't have to, but because the humans aren't, he came down. But what has to happen still? Because if all the other people went up on the mountain, what's going to happen to them? They're dead. So what has to happen? Moses, the mediator, has to ascend to the Father. So God is coming down, the mediator is going up, representing the people in God's presence. Whether it's because, as Link believes, they rebelled and now they can't go, or my argument, they never could have gone. The very thing they needed to do, they can't. That's why Moses has to do it. So God has come down, Moses has gone up. And they're going up to talk, face to face, if you will. So Moses then takes us to the top of the mountain. Now, is he giving us every detail of this encounter? No. Does the Bible usually give us every detail of an encounter? No. Moses skips, oh, I went over here, found a trail, and started hiking up. 4 hours later, I got to the top of the mountain, or however long it took Moses to get up there. Because it is a mountain, and he's got to go to the top. Skips it. Why? It's irrelevant. What's relevant? He went to the top, he talked to God. All this stuff is irrelevant for the moment. So verse 21 gets to the top of the mountain, and then the Lord said to Moses, and here's one of those great twists, go down. Now, I don't know about you. You ever gone on a hike in the mountains? You get to the end of the trail, or you thought you got to the end of the trail, and what do you see? More trail. Moses just got to the top of the mountain because God said, come up here. I'm here. Okay, go down. Are you sure? Go down to the people. Go down and warn the people, lest they break through the Lord to look, and many of them perish. And so what's happening in verse 21 is the reader, because the people on the bottom of the mountain aren't seeing any of this, we're only seeing it because we're the readers of what Moses recounts later. The reader gets the benefit of following Moses to the mountaintop. We get to go where they didn't because the mediators come. And as soon as Moses gets there, it seems, now again, we don't get the whole encounter, so who knows how long Moses has been up there. But the first thing that we're told in the account is as soon as Moses gets there, what does God tell him to do? Go down, but for a very specific purpose. What's the purpose? Warn them. Remind them, Moses, that they are sinners. Remind them, Moses, that they have no standing before me. Remind them, Moses, that the only thing they deserve is death. But specifically, he says, go down and warn them, because if you don't, some of them, not all of them, because a lot of them are afraid, some of them are going to try to break through the cloud and enter into God's presence on their own, alone. Some are going to try to do it without you, Moses. You're up here, so some are going to try to get here with you, but not by coming through you. They're going to try to come on their own. They're going to try to break through alone. The picture is, Moses, unless you remind them of what I commanded you, some of them are going to try to come without you, to come without Moses. And of course, we've now said it a gazillion times, what happens if they do? They die. This is what happens when sinners enter into the presence of God on their terms, not his. Now, if you're reading along and you're reading verse 21 here, it's not unreasonable for you to be thinking what was going on at the end of the last paragraph and now at the beginning of this one. Some of you might be asking, since Moses and God were already speaking in verse 19, why didn't God just tell him then to tell the people, don't try to come up on the mountain? Right? He's having a conversation. It'd been real easy. Save Moses 4 hours of hiking or whatever. Moses, tell him don't come up here. But I think there may be two reasons why it takes place this way. One thing it does is it highlights the separation of the people from God. God doesn't say it to where they can understand it. God only speaks to who? The mediator. And I think that's the other point. It highlights not only their separation from God, I think its point is to highlight Moses' role as the mediator. He's the one who's going to bring the people to God. He's the one who's going to tell them, for God, do this, don't do that. And so in the process, God is highlighting for them in a very visible way, right? They see God talking to Moses at the bottom. They see Moses go up. A little while later, Moses comes down and says, I got a word for you from God. It highlights for them Moses' relationship with God. This is the one I'm talking to. This is the one I'm going to speak through. This is the one who is your mediator. There's no other way. There's no one else. Now, think about in the New Testament. How many times does God in the Gospels visibly or physically manifest himself in a way that an audience can know of his connection to Jesus? Think of the baptism, right? He comes up out of the water, Spirit comes down, voice from heaven, this one's my son. This is the one I'm well pleased with. Or think what happens when they crucify him. Storms and darkness and earthquakes. Here's this connection to the mediator. So I think it's twofold why he just didn't simply tell him at the bottom of the mountain, Moses, tell him don't come up. I think he wants to highlight who's the only one allowed to come up. Moses. And what's going to happen to everybody else if they don't do it Moses' way? They're dead. Don't think he can say it many more times in this passage. Do it right, you're going to live. Do it the way I tell you. Do it wrong, and you're going to die. But he's not done with additional directions, if you will. So go down, tell him this. Verse 22 begins with also in the English. So there's more. Also, let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. So the priests are supposed to consecrate themselves seemingly even further. Everybody's been consecrated. Priests need to be consecrated again. Don't miss something here significant. To this point in the Old Testament, not just in the book of Exodus, to this point in the entire Old Testament, the role of priest doesn't exist yet. There are no priests, like we're going to think about priests in the Old Testament. Yeah, there was Melchizedek in Genesis, who was a priest of the Lord, but he wasn't Jewish. He wasn't connected to the Abrahamic covenant, other than he encountered Abraham. And through the Exodus, there are no priests. Now, we've had a priest who in this book. Remember who the priest was? Jethro. But he was the priest of Midian. And then he led the people in a worship ceremony, seemingly acting like a priest and modeling for others who would do the same thing. But so far, there are no priests per se. And so we've got to ask, what priests is God talking about here? Now, earlier in the chapter, he's already told Israel, you will be my nation of priests, right? You'll be a royal nation, a holy priesthood. But now he's talking about not all the nation being able to be priests. Now he's talking about specific people who are being able to be priests. And so here again is that picture, perhaps, that because the people didn't respond to God's trumpet call, guess what they cannot be? They can't all be priests. Only certain ones can, and they need to reconsecrate themselves. And so it might be that the verse is speaking, in one sense, prophetically about the future role of priests. We're going to get priests in the book of Numbers. So it may just be simply, one day when you all get priests, they've got to do something special to do their job. Or it could be that the verse is speaking retroactively in a sense. What I mean is, it's calling them priests, because later on when Moses writes down the book, they now have priests. And so what he's using is a word they know in 2021 to describe something from 1776. The men who did this for you, you didn't have a name for them, they're priests. You could read it one of two ways, but I think the bigger picture here is they went from a nation of priests to now individuals. Already, this picture is that it's starting to unravel. They've not even got the Ten Commandments yet, and it's unraveling. In fact, again, that's part of Pete Link's argument is the Ten Commandments are given because they've already blown the covenant. They were told to come up the mountain, they didn't, so what's God got to do? Give them rules on how to live when you don't come up on the mountain. But we've gone from a nation of priests to individual priests, whether it's a picture of looking forward to one day when Aaron and his group are priests, or whether it's reminding them, you already had priests in your midst. The big picture is, even the ones who are specifically tasked with bringing people to God, what must they do first? They've got to get right with God. They can't come to God without risking dying. In fact, how's the verse end in verse 22? Death. Death's going to be their punishment if they don't obey here. And that's why you've got the priest who every year has to go in the Holy of Holies and make the sacrifice before he can lay the hands on the scapegoat. That's why the writer of Hebrews talks about the fact that every year, year after year, what did the high priest have to do? He had to make atonement for his sins before he could make atonement for everybody else's sins. And so they're going to need priests now, but even the priests need priests in a sense. Because if Moses was tasked with consecrating the nation, who's going to consecrate the priests? Somebody's got to do it for them. And so if Link is right, everything's already starting to unravel, and we've not even got the Ten Commandments yet. So Moses, go tell them these things. Moses responds back to God first. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain and consecrate it. And so Moses, in this conversation with God, repeats the warnings that we'd already been given in verses 12 and 13. Now, this is not Moses arguing with God. This is not Moses trying to remind God of something God had forgotten. Because think about it, that you could read it that way. Moses, go down and tell them, don't come up here, they're going to die. Oh, Moses, God, don't forget, you've already told us this. I don't think that's what's going on here, because what does God know? Everything. I think the reason Moses includes verse 23 in that statement is he's actually reminding us, the reader, of something we might have forgotten. Don't forget, they're not supposed to come up here at all. And so I think it's a reminder for us, the reader, not a reminder for God. Because remember, whenever you come across what are referred to as historical narratives in the Bible, where it seems like you're just reading history, the author always has something bigger in mind than just telling you historical fact. Historical narratives recount. They recount things that have already happened. They remind the reader of something that's already happened. And they do that to reiterate things that are important. So if you go back through chapter 19, go back and count how many times God says, don't come up here or I'm going to kill you. Don't come up here, I'll kill you. Don't come up here, I'll kill you. Moses includes this verse here, not because God doesn't know all that. Moses wants to make sure the reader remembers this is the key point. You come into the presence of God uninvited, what's going to happen? You're dead. This is where, by the way, me and Dr. Link disagree. He thinks the rules changed after verse 16 when they refused to come up. I think Moses is going, God, you've already told us not to come up. I think the pictures through all of chapter 19 were not to come without the mediator. It's not a new rule. It's Moses going, remember, this was already the rule. But he's telling us, not God, to make sure we remember that. Because what's God there for? Relationship. But it's his way, not our way. And thus, I think verse 23 is, to use another literature term, an authorial aside. It's when you read a book and the author is telling the story, and after you're reading it, you're into it, you forget the author's there, even though you're reading his or her book. You're so into it, you forget. It's like when you watch a movie, you get so into the movie, the people become real to you. I mean, how many of you weep with people on movies who weep? You're not the only one. There's some other ones who are lying. But an authorial aside is where the author says, here, let me tell you something you might be missing. Or those of you who have seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Ferris Bueller, the main character, does something that wasn't commonly done since the days of Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock did it. And then no one else really did it until Ferris Bueller. And that's where the character on camera is playing out the role in the scene. And then while the scene's going on and he's talking to these people, he looks to the camera and tells you, the viewer, something. They don't hear it. They don't see it. It's a secret between you and the viewer. That's what's going on in verse 23. That's Moses talking to God going, don't forget, go up on the mountain, you die. And so after that authorial aside, then we get verse 24. And the Lord said to him. So God is not responding to Moses. Lord, in verse 24, goes right back to what he was just talking about in verse 22. Right? Verse 22 is about priests. What's verse 24 about? And the Lord said to him, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you, but don't let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. And so Moses, moment of conversation towards the camera. Now God's speaking again. Go down and get Aaron. Go down and come up, bring with you Aaron. Now, part of that is because of Aaron's role. Aaron's priestly role was going to be vastly different from the rest of them. Because what is Aaron going to be? Not yet. He's going to be the high priest. Aaron's going to be different than the rest of them. He's the one who's going to be allowed into the Holy of Holies, not them. He's the one who's going to spread blood on the Ark of the Covenant, not them. They can go into the tabernacle and screw up, and except for his sons, not die. Aaron goes into the Holy of Holies, into God's presence, and he messes up. What happens to him? He's dead. And so Aaron is very different. And so go tell these priests to consecrate themselves, but bring me this priest. Bring this one to me. So go down, get your brother Aaron, tell the other priests, stay away, and tell who else? Everybody else to do what? Stay away from me. Don't come up here. Otherwise, they might break through the cloud and he will break out against them. And so over and over in this chapter is a reminder. You come my way or you're dead. And how's his way? Through the mediator and the high priest. Verse 25. So Moses went down to the people and he told them. Like we've seen so many times before in the book of Exodus, what did Moses do? He obeyed. Moses did what he was told. If Moses did not obey to the letter, if Moses did not obey immediately, if Moses did not obey completely, what happens? The people would die. And if he hadn't obeyed, if he hadn't been faithful, the people could not ever enter God's presence. You can't have a sinful Savior. You can't have a mediator who's part of the problem. Here's the scary thing. The Gen Xers, the ones who were born before 89, they're getting a little squishy. The Gen Zers and the millennials, I saw a survey a couple years ago that many of the millennials, those born after 89 up to about 2002 or so, the millennium, near a third of them then believed that Jesus sinned, that he's just like us in every way. And now the latest numbers coming out, and I just saw this the other day, the latest numbers coming about that generation, 46% of them don't know if there's a God and don't care. That's half of all the Americans under the age of 30 don't care if there's a God or not. God cares. He's provided a mediator who is also, by the way, the high priest too, who did everything right, perfectly. Because if he didn't, he's going to die, and we're going to die with him. And so Moses is setting the stage, not just for the Ten Commandments, but for the Messiah who does what? Comes and obeys every law. Because that's the mediator we need. Not a mediator like Moses who later on sins and needs one himself. We need a mediator who can come into the presence of God boldly and live and make the sacrifice we all need to get there. That's all in anticipation of the Ten Commandments. Ask the average churchgoer, what's the Exodus? Plagues and commandments. I was looking at one commentary on the book of Exodus. It's about that thick, so 350 pages maybe. Chapter 19 is around page 300. In other words, the argument this guy is ultimately making, if nothing else, just by the sheer volume of words he's using, is the most important parts of the book of Exodus take place up to this point, and the rest start the story moving forward to, they blew it, now what? Because rather than coming into the presence of God, at the end of the book, the part that everybody hates to read, God's got to tell them how to build a tabernacle so he can come into their presence. And so all this is built up. And in one sense, the rest of the book is let down because they blew it. And what do we all do? Same thing. We come to church on Sunday, we hear the sermons, we read the Sunday school lessons, we go, yeah, and then we go out and act like we didn't read any of it the next day. And expect God to let us break through to the next Sunday and have another spiritual high while we disobey him every step of the way. Doesn't work that way, and Exodus reminds us, never has. Let's go ahead and pray, get out of here. This Sunday, Mark, again, chapter 3, looking at the middle part of the passage and the very end of the chapter as we look at sometimes a part of Jesus' experience that we overlook. But read ahead, be ready for it. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this evening, for the chance you've given us, the privilege to come into your presence in prayer, and Lord, to hear from you as you give your word to, in this case, Moses, who tells us what you're like and what you want and what our only hope is. Lord, pray that we've heard the lesson, that, Lord, that we might learn the lesson, and that we might glorify you every step of the way in total obedience. For all this we ask and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.